This has been a topic that has come up before with the EPA, but of the endangered species, only about 3.7 of the species have ever been delisted. And the reason I bring that back is because I obviously care about animals, but it is in my firm belief that when you have certain species that are taking resources away from others that need to be listed, it doesn't really accurately serve out the purpose of what the Endangered Species Act was supposed to do. So the legislation introduced by my colleagues rightly seeks to disapprove of the Fish and Wildlife Service's rules regarding the status of lesser prairie chickens and northern long-eared bats under the ESA. And by removing species from that list that have recovered and focusing resources on species that are still at risk, we can better prioritize our conservation efforts and allocate resources where they are needed the most. The Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service share the responsibility for administering the ESA. Ensuring that these agencies are properly listing and delisting species is something that's particularly important to me, especially being that I have many endangered species in my area, to include the manatee and green sea turtle, of which are struggling to recover accurately. My question would be for Mr. Gerton. When deciding the new rules like those of the lesser prairie chicken and northern long-eared bat, what information does Fish and Wildlife Services consider?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. So we go through a very robust, scientifically driven process to make a determination. I don't want to bore you with all the details of it, but in general terms, we either petition to look at the status of species based on constituent concerns or those raised by a court, or just based on our work with our state fish and game and tribal partners, we've noticed a difference in the status and trend of how a species is doing on the landscape. And so there's a first gate that you would go through, so to speak, which is called a 90-day finding, where we're either presented with information that causes us to say, there's positive information here, and we're going to initiate a more formal rulemaking process called a 12-month finding, or we'll say that there's not adequate information here, so we'll decline looking at the status of that species. And then we go through a very robust formula of 5-factor analysis, looking at threats including disease and predation, looking at adequacy of regulatory mechanisms, looking at habitat or threats to destruction, and we rely on science largely from the states, the tribes, our colleagues USGS, NOAA, and others, and work that through a decision matrix. A lot of it is a species status assessment, but it's scientifically driven, Congresswoman.
So being that the recovery rates in species are ever changing, how often does the Fish and Wildlife Service review those rules for the species?
So we are required every 5 years to do a status assessment of listed species and do a determination of where they stand, where the trend lines are showing us their population is going. You're familiar with our work in the manatee right now. They're currently listed as a threatened species. Some advocates have asked us to put in a uplisting to endangered. We don't think that's the case now, even as we're dealing with those mortality events the last couple of winters. There's still 9,000 animals out there in that population, and they're able to withstand, and we've been very aggressive working with our partner agencies in remediation to get them through this tough patch, mostly on the East Coast.
Just real quick, because obviously that's something that we love, our manatees in Florida. Don't let that mistake you. But just out of curiosity, why are you guys not upgrading that? Because we have a huge issue with red tide. I believe it's in part because of the massive sewage that we get dumped into our ocean, and it contributes to the nutrients for the red tide. But, our manatees are dying, and then we obviously have the boating accident. So why are they not being uplisted?
We look at the totality of information, Congresswoman. In our scientific judgment, we believe in the case of the manatee, particularly in Florida, the status of threatened is adequate, provides almost all the safeguards that are needed, particularly given the robust partnership we have with Florida Power and Light, State Game Commission, private landowners, and others. We have wakes in place with the outdoor recreation industry, all kinds of proactive measures. We're focused very much on what's going on in the Indian River Lagoon. That's where the unusual mortality event has been taking place. Through a combination of rescue, rehab, supplemental feeding, and other techniques, we've been able to stabilize that, and we got a lucky break this past year with winter weather on our side. But at this point, the service's view is that the threatened status gives them the safeguards they need to ensure survival going forward.
Okay, and then I guess my last question for you would be, so our beaches have sea turtles, and we're one of the few spots in the world for the nesting grounds for these sea turtles. And one of the issues that we have is beach renourishment. And so we have the Army Corps of Engineers that's not wanting to do beach renourishment, but obviously we have an endangered species there. So just in your opinion, do you believe that other organizations should be held accountable if they're knowingly preventing habitat protection, for example, our sea turtles?
Congresswoman, I'm not as familiar with the specifics on your case you're raising there, but in very general terms, we work very collaboratively with the Corps of Engineers. These beach nourishment and replenishment projects are very complex. We'd be glad to follow up with you or your leadership team here in DC to get you a briefing and talk some more about that issue, because it's going to be a complicated one, but we're glad to follow up with you and set up some briefings here in your district.
Just real quick, who loves sea turtles? Like, everyone loves them, right? So I think the Army Corps of Engineers should work with you guys and give us our habitat for those sea turtles. Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you, Congresswoman.